Welcome back to MSP Confidential, everybody. It's Friday, and it's time to bring on another fantastic guest today. Joining me, I have Remy, CEO of Convergence Networks, and you're based out of Portland, if I recall. Chris, good to have you on, man. How are you?
Thank you. Great to be here. I'm doing great today. Happy Friday.
Awesome, awesome. Well, we had this sort of happenstance introduction. David DePapas connected and said, "Hey, we've been doing some cool stuff, growing the business, doing some acquisitions. Chris is a great guy to consider bringing on the podcast for a conversation." And so here you are. What's been on your mind lately? What's going on in your side of the world?
We're busy as most MSPs are, and we're focused on growth. So we've had some acquisitions in the last couple of years, and working hard to transform our business and do a better job of supporting clients. Anybody in this industry knows it's a full-time gig, so we're very much focused on that, and things have been going well. We've got a great team and had some good success lately, so things are moving in the right direction.
So one of the things that I thought was super interesting about your trajectory is a bit of your enterprise background, and I think it's always interesting when people kind of, you could say, step down into the SMB, SME market from enterprise. I wouldn't call it stepping down necessarily. You know, there are so many more small businesses or medium businesses that enterprises that it's kind of a whole different beast altogether. And I wanted to maybe start there, ask you a bit about what was about this market in particular that was interesting or attractive for you to come in and try to innovate with?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it is a different animal, different beast, if you will. Yeah, my background, I've worked in large enterprise organizations for most of my career. I started out working for a large shipping conglomerate out of Denmark and had an opportunity to live all over the world with them. Moved on to Anderson Consulting, which became Accenture, and then moved to a CIO role for a publicly held company here in Oregon, and then moved to in every single case, we were dealing with large enterprise customers, Fortune 500 and large companies, a lot of them in high tech. Was very fortunate. I had a lot of different types of experience and got exposed to a lot, which was really, really neat and interesting. And then moved on to a private equity-backed company here in Oregon. And even though we were small in size, we're roughly 50 people, we were supporting very large enterprise clients, primarily in consumer electronics and retail and services. And so I had the same client base, and it was enterprise, and how do you focus on enterprise? And you might have a total of 30 or 50 customers with a company like that you might be able to target domestically. And it was a phenomenal opportunity, exposure to get and working with some really interesting companies and really get, I would say, exposed to some phenomenal people and kind of concepts and ideas of where they were driving and going, and really hadn't worked in SMB. So I'm new in the last 3.5 years of the SMB game, when I joined Convergence. And the big thing for me and why I was attracted to it is I was a small, business operator moving to a medium-sized company, and IT infrastructure and cybersecurity and all the trends that we deal with and are immersed in from an MSP standpoint. Had a lot of friends that were struggling as business owners and operators in this space. So they ran a small to medium-sized business, and they might have had a compromise or other types of issues with their organization. And I just felt that it was an area that I noted I had personally experienced and had challenges with, and others did as well. I just felt like it was almost unlimited from an opportunity standpoint. And so I met my private equity partner that we'll talk more about here in a second. Really enjoyed what they had to say, liked the attributes of what they were about and their reputation and the way they're really looking at this market and running and operating the business in the right way. And so I joined forces. And so did that about 3.5 years ago. And it's been great. A lot of learnings. I'm by no means am I an MSP expert. I've got a great board of directors that really guided me to join a peer group to get better versed in this industry and space. And that's been really great. I've been really impressed with people's willingness to share in this industry. It's really unique. I think MSP owners just take it for granted that there's so much sharing that goes on in our industry. I've
That's
come
so
from
true.
industries that is not normal, right?
Yeah.
It is very, very unique, and I know people talk about it, but it's been really helpful for me. There's been a lot of people been really generous with time and coaching through that process. And so for me, when I look at the SMB space and how it's different or similar to enterprise, I mean, business is business. I think in when I was working in enterprise, I was working with a subset of an organization, not necessarily all the C leadership. And with an MSP, we are so integral to a company. IT is now so integral to a company and how they operate and communicate with customers and suppliers and each other, that any problems or disruption that they have is mission critical. And so, I equate it to you're only as good as your last ticket, meaning your last problem that you solved, is that we have to be on and really supportive, hypersensitive to that with clients on an ongoing basis. And the element of that is support with that, customer centric focus is, I think in our space, it's, really unique and really different and very different than enterprise. I think enterprise, things move more slowly. Yes, it's important. Yes, you need to add value, but it's not at the pace that we have to support clients with. So I think that that's different. Being able to sell to really anybody and have it be almost limitless. I mean, we're more choosy in the types of customers we engage with, but when you're working with enterprise customers, you kind of know your customers and who you're dealing with from a B2B standpoint. But with SMB, there's just a lot of opportunity, and if you can find ways to really add value, and really do that in a unique way. I look at it, I like to have an unlimited growth mindset, and I look at this industry and it has that, which is really cool. I think, when I look at the MSP space specifically, I think people are trying really hard to innovate. And I think, if you're a smaller MSP, I think that's harder because can you make the investment in what you need to in tools and solutions? I would say that I was surprised that this industry, being IT, if you will, was a bit behind in different areas. You've had automation and customer portals and, even to a lesser extent, AI, it's been called different things, data mining and things like that, historically on the enterprise side. And now MSPs are really starting to adopt that. And I think our customers are pulling us into that in a really significant way.
Mm-hmm.
A lot more dialogue on how to implement AI and automation. And whether you like it or not, we're getting drug into those conversations now. So, at a high level, those are the main differences. Other than that, I mean, everybody's got high expectations. You got to continue to perform. You have to have a great team to make that happen. And we're fortunate we've been able to build a great team. But those are the biggest observations that I've had.
So you said you were working on transforming the business. And I wanted to maybe double click on that. What does transform currently mean to you? And I think this is maybe a hotly debated thing because some people argue there is no transform. There is just only kind of grow and evolve to perhaps. But I wonder how that manifests for you inside of Convergence.
Yeah, and the nomenclature that I use, I look at this as a journey. There's never really an end state. We have to continue to evolve, if you will, for our clients and work hard to get better in how we service them and do it effectively and efficiently. And sometimes it's a scenario where people have an end goal in mind, and the reality is that's just not real. It's just not the way it works anymore. And so when I look at transformation, I'm really talking about how do we get better? How do we better support clients? How do we do it in a more effective way, and in some cases a more efficient way? And so for me, that's a huge factor. But it's not an end goal. I don't have, if we're just going to get this process redone, we'll be all good. We have to continue to really drive those improvements, and we've seen them in our organization. I mean, everything from client satisfaction scores to things like that have up leveled, and with that, our expectations go up as well, right? So we're continuing to try and set a higher bar. And so that's when I talk about transformation, that's what I'm talking about. It's continual, and how do we continue to get better and set a higher bar. But yeah, we just had a quarterly business review this last couple of weeks ago, and we talked about that and realized, hey, we've made a ton of progress, and yet we're not satisfied. How do we continue to move the needle and move up? And we have a growth mindset within the organization, which is great, and that's a big factor that we're looking at.
Reminds me of somebody I know who says, grateful but never satisfied. And you're
Yes.
right. I think it's one of those things that the goalposts are always moving. There is no end state. I guess manifesting the journey is kind of an interesting thing that I hear more MSPs talking about, especially right now when we seem to be in a shift where the trust and relationship component is becoming ever important, more so than maybe 20 years ago is kind of the comparison I'm trying to put forth, simply because it was much more tactical and operational a little while ago, and now there's definitely this layer where I think the role of the MSP has changed so much. Technology is so broad across the entire aspects of the business. And so that's a question I have for you is, especially coming from enterprise where perhaps there's a certain type of relationship that is transactional to a certain extent, but there's also maybe long-term, really trust-built relationships. How do you see that playing out right now for Convergence in this, critical growth period? How do you maintain a bit of that core connectivity to trust and relationship building?
Yeah, that's a great point. And I think it translates. There's a lot of ways to look at it, but I think it translates for us best as how we look at. We're in an acquisition mode, so we're growth focused. We're trying to double the organization in the next 3 or 4 years, and we'll get that through organic and inorganic growth, both. But through the inorganic growth through acquisitions, we're very much focused on keeping teams in that local market with local relationships. And why we're so intentionally focused on that is they've built that trust level with clients.
Yeah.
And it's hard to come in and centralize centralize contact centers. And there's companies working to do that. But we're in a human business, right? We're in a services business that just happens to be IT. And for us, that is a key and core component that we're able to continue to support clients in a great way. And for me, if you can continue to have those relationships, but then add more value with either deeper expertise or more professionalized execution or improved tools and visibility and transparency, that's where I think, for us at least, that's where we're focused on. It's how do you take those great relationships that you've built over time and then continue to add value, because we're in that mode, right? If some people will say, well, relationships are great, but this is becoming a more commoditized space. I think it goes beyond just having the great relationship. It's what do you continue to add value on, and are you meeting the client based on where they're going, and how do you move up the proverbial strategic food chain, and that you're able to add value and solve business problems beyond, am I moving you to the cloud, right, or something more basic.
Right.
And so yeah, those relationships are massively important. And we're hyper focused on not only executing well, but I think we're evolving as well on how we're communicating to clients and how we're showing them what we're doing on their behalf, with our security operations center and NOC and things like that. What are things that we're providing that clients, might not see, and we're out there protecting them, 24/7. I think improving that communication and showing your value, I think is something else that we're also focused on.
Well, maybe let's talk about the PE factor here a little bit, because you're in this interesting, unique position of having been on both sides of that coin, both at a PE firm, but also now at a company that is PE backed. And I feel like these are some of the motions that are so heavily influenced by those overlords, if you will. And it's interesting that you are so hyper focused on the relationship piece. And it kind of signals a bit of this attention there is now in the M&A market with MSPs around retention and expansion, and how important it is to drive a little bit of that longer term view of the relationship with customers. And so I'm curious how that PE relationship has worked for you guys at Convergence, and how you see that playing out longer term.
Yeah, I think we're fortunate. So this is the fifth financial investor slash private equity firm I've worked with, and I have a good sense as to what makes a great partner and what are the elements around it, and that's been, and I've been really fortunate. I've worked with some great private equity firms, um, and so that relationship for someone that is considering selling or working with a private equity firm, I mean, it can be a phenomenal relationship. It really can be. There's a lot of great private equity firms out there that can be really great from a catalyst standpoint to help collaborate and push folks to get better. But they're unique in the standpoint that there are a bunch of different characteristics about them that you really have to go eyes wide open into that relationship, and really think about beyond who's going to give me the most money for my company or my valuation. There's a number of other factors that folks need to consider or think about with that relationship. And there's so much. It's a very frothy market right now for MSPs. There's a lot of private equity firms on the hunt. There's a lot of strategic firms on the hunt looking for companies. And for us, that we've got a great partner who's very patient and has been an organization that, when I joined the company, we were having some challenges. We had lost some employees and subsequently some customers, and it was never really a focus on how do we just drive the bottom line and how do we drive cost out, because it's really hard in my experience to save your way to prosperity. It's much better to try and grow your way out of it, if you will. And so they're right aligned with me to be able to go do that and make that happen. And so, but yeah, there's a ton of factors that companies and people and owners need to consider when they think about who do they want to join forces with and what does that look like. And I think it becomes an afterthought for a lot of folks, and it's one that it needs to be front and center as folks are contemplating a partnership, because it's key.
Well, let's talk about some of those things, because certainly, at least from my own personal experience of having sold, there was maybe an air of it's a one-way street evaluation in a sense, that we're being evaluated by the acquirer, and that's kind of whether they buy or not is kind of up to them. But I think there's this whole component of the seller also evaluating their buyer, especially depending on obviously what they want to do post-acquisition. They want to stay involved, they want to exit, what's going to happen to the teams, et cetera. And so what are some of the top things that you, after having been on both sides of the equation, are things that perhaps sellers are not thinking about in terms of evaluating their potential PE acquirer?
Well, there's a bunch. So
I'm sure there are.
Yeah, I mean, it all starts with a lot of reflection as an owner, or a partial owner of a business, as you try and head down this path. And in my mind, it's what are your objectives as an owner? What are you trying to do? Or is this bringing on a partner? Is it because you want to become a platform and you want to aggregate other MSPs and build that? That's on the journey that we're on. Not always the easiest thing to do, but a lot of folks are contemplating that. And so are you looking for a private equity firm to help support that? And are you part of a roll-up, right? Are you part of another organization that's out acquiring other MSPs, and then you're a part of that and a portion of that? And then there's really the scenario that's out there now too, that's pretty prevalent is, are you part of a buy and hold group, which is I buy you, you keep the name, you keep, everything about you. We support you from a back office standpoint, and we just kind of let you go, and you take some chips off the table and continue to run and operate. And there's flavors of all of those. For me, if you think about it from a platform standpoint, or if you're joining forces with a private equity firm, and that's really what you're focused on, or a financial strategic partner, for me, it goes well beyond price, and people need to use the courting. If you're selling your company, you're working through an investment banker or broker. That courting opportunity is not just for them to get comfortable with you. You really have to leverage that time with them, and they're going to be. I've done this many times, but they're going to go through a process where they're asking a ton of questions to get comfortable with your business and really understand it. You have to do the same thing, and you have to be prepared for that. And for me, when I think about, a potential partner, I'm thinking about things like, do they have experience in my industry? And why that's important is if you have a private equity firm that hasn't worked with MSPs in the past, they don't understand the context and the nuance, and it's going to be a learning situation. And you don't want to spend your time doing that, frankly speaking. I would want somebody that really understands our space and the nuance around it. I think for me, it's also, do they have experience in the scenario that you're talking about? So if it's a platform and you're rolling up companies, have they done that before? Have they done it successfully? I mean, that's the other factor too, is how many successful investments and roll-ups have they done? And what does that look like? And where did they add value in that process? Where they, there's a difference between a financial partner and an operating partner or a transformational partner. And really understanding that too is another factor, meaning an operating partner is going to come in with a playbook and say, here's what I want you to do. Go drive this playbook. You're going to have less of a voice. And they're going to be, really in your camp, if you will, helping you make decisions. And some folks don't necessarily want to do that. They want to be, hey, I want a financial partner to let me run the business. And so really understanding how they operate, how they see themselves, I think is really, really key.
I love that.
I think it's a major factor that people often don't consider when they jump into a relationship. And private equity, I equate it to business with a shot clock, in that there's high expectations when you join with them that you got to perform. So you're going to collectively set goals, and then you got to work hard to make that happen. And it's a scenario where you got to go in eyes wide open that's really what you're talking about and signing up to. I think the other things for me in considering a private equity partner is what's their reputation in partnering with management teams? Are they a firm that comes in and, works with you and works through the good and the bad and really helps foster and support growth? Are they, are they changing out executives quickly if they don't see what they like? And so looking at the average tenure of the CEOs that they have on board, how many of those were the original owners, the original CEOs of the companies, I think is an important thing to look at. Also, are they high integrity? Meaning, do they have a reputation for fair dealing? Do they have a reputation for, honoring their commitments? Do they do what they say they were going to do? I think that's a really big factor that people don't look at. Are they negotiating the price to the nth degree at the very end? That's a red flag for me if they've changed the deal completely with no real changes in the business because they've got leverage over you. That's a sign of not a lot of integrity. Another big factor for me with private equity is how do they handle bad news? And you say, well, I've always executed well, Chris. Why do I need to worry about that? We know from an MSP standpoint, there's going to be some bad news. It's just inherent to our business. Things change. Companies sell, business shifts. There's a lot of different things that potentially can happen. And how they respond to that is massively important. And the reason being is if they're overreacting or, not really working with you to understand why something happened and then what we're going to collectively do about it, it just can be a really bad scenario and create a lot of headaches. And then you get into a scenario where they start micromanaging you, and nobody wants that. So I think that's a huge factor. And so how might you determine that? I think a good way to try and determine how do they handle it is to talk to some of their current and previous CEOs, and also ask to talk to people where things didn't go well. And you'll see from a private equity firm, how did they actually handle the situation? Do they handle it fairly? Were they supportive of the different folks that were running the company? What did it ultimately look like?
Or
I
even
think
how do they handle the request to speak with some of their other portfolio companies, I suppose.
yeah, it's huge because if somebody's not willing to give you access to other people that they work with for whatever reason, that's obviously a red flag for me in a big way. So really understanding that I think is big. And then there's other considerations as well. What's their average time horizon for their investments? Are they going to give equity grants to your team? I mean, a lot of folks are thinking about stewardship and what's this going to look like going forward. My experience has been a lot of owners haven't necessarily given equity to their team members. A good private equity firm will set aside 10 or 15% to help grant to your team. And they should, because you want them all, in the same boat, if you will, with an oar rowing in the same direction. And I think that equity grant helps to shift the mindset as they talk about what's next and how do we grow it. And so that's a factor. I think I would ask if I'm considering selling, who am I going to be working with as my partner on a day-to-day or week-to-week basis? Often you come in with a deal team that'll work to get the deal done, and then they'll introduce you to their partner. And I would really spend some time face-to-face with that individual. I go to a meal with them, a couple of meals with them, see how they interact. Is this a person that I'm going to want to work with? Because that trust factor and that comfortableness factor is going to be massively important as you work to grow the organization. And I think a lot of cases people look at that as an afterthought. It's like, yeah, I can work with anybody. It's definitely a
It's never
primary
that easy,
factor.
first of all. Yeah, there's always
What's that?
nuances. It's never that easy. There's always nuances to it, for sure.
Yeah, and so I think that's it too. And the bottom line for me on all this is, are you ready to work with private equity? I found a lot of owners and folks that run companies are, when I ask if you're ready, it's different, right? I mentioned business with a shot clock, not to use a sports term, but they're expecting results, and a lot of folks, they started a company because they didn't want to have a boss, right? And so now you're in a scenario that you're going to be working for somebody, and they're going to want to really understand, and you're going to have to over communicate and provide a lot of transparency to them. Are they, is it somebody you're going to want to work with, and can you ultimately build that trust? And so it's interesting, and I talked earlier about this, but I take the approach that I provide complete transparency with what's going about happening within the business, and private equity expects that. And I had a phenomenal mentor early in my career that helped teach me how to be a CEO. And he said, Chris, bad news is not like wine. It does not get better with age. And I'm a firm believer in that. And so, we can talk about what it's like to work with private equity, but at least at the selection side, those are the things that as an owner that's selling my company, I'm really looking at.
Yeah.
And, that, obviously is a bit of a variation. If you're selling to a company, you're getting rolled up. I mean, you're looking at different factors of what's your role and what's the time horizon, what are the expectations, and is this team that I'm partnering with, do I feel like they're really unique and be able to grow this thing? Am I going to believe in that organization and that executive team? Can they in fact grow it? So I think it depends on the scenario, but true private equity and selling to private equity or financial partner, those are the primary factors that I would look at.
I think there is maybe one component of being in a PE relationship, which is, and for the majority, as far as I know, of MSP owners who sell, it's the first time they'll be working with the board effectively. And
Yeah.
and I think the board conversation is super interesting because you talked about being in the peer groups, you're in the Evolve community, and for a long time, I feel like this maybe functions as a replacement board or a de facto board to some of the MSPs in the group because they are getting a lot of guidance and feedback about what they're doing from their group. At the same time, it's maybe the risk of sameness in an industry that's perhaps been afraid to innovate too far outside of the proven track to some extent. And so I'm curious to hear a bit of your experience working with boards, specifically around the appetite for innovating and transforming and changing a bit of the course, if you will, when it's warranted.
Yeah, and I think similar to working with a private equity firm, there's a lot of opportunity to really help you accelerate and improve your business. And I look at boards as really a tool to help you do that. But it all starts with a goal once again, right? So if you're thinking about establishing a board, what's your end goal in mind? Are you going to transition this business to a family member? Are you going to, keep running it till you die and then your family has to deal with it? I mean, is it a scenario where you're looking to grow and sell in the next 3 to 5 years, or are you looking to maybe do a deal right now? I think a lot of that really drives how you look at a board. I think also what's your size and what you can afford, right? Because if you're really small, you might bring on an advisor, but not a full board. And so I think those are all factors that people have to take into consideration. I think though, having a board can be a huge advantage. I find it as a huge advantage when I have a great board. And I'm fortunate I do. I've got a couple of independent board members, my private equity firm, and a couple of previous owners that were some of the original investors. And what I find beneficial out of it is the ability to collaborate and for them to really challenge me. And so I wouldn't say it's constructive conflict, right? Constructive conflict's more at my first team level, my senior leadership team. We do have a lot of constructive conflict. That's how we improve. But it's more of really challenging me on the thought process and taking other perspectives. And so when I think of having a board or the benefits of it, I think that collaboration and opportunity can help me make a lot better decisions, because I'm of the firm belief the older that I get, I don't know everything. And so I want to find people that are super smart in areas that I'm not, or I don't have as much experience. And if you can reflect on that and really think about where am I really strong and where do I need the help? And so if you think about the elements of within a business, am I a great CEO and kind of thought leader, or am I operationally focused, or if I'm sales focused, or if I don't have those characteristics, am I looking for board members that have that? Or, maybe we're not as strong in finance or M&A or acquisitions. How do I go find those people? And I think the old adage that folks had when it came to board members was, they're going to help me grow my business by providing contacts or opportunities. I don't really find that board members are great for that. I find board members are great for really helping challenge of the possible and talk to you, about what's possible, help you think through scenarios and ideas. It's not going to be an introduction to a friend of theirs that needs an MSP. Mm-hmm. So when I talk about like sales as an example, I'm thinking sales methodology, really thinking about value proposition. How are you solving problems? How are you prospecting? Things like that. I find a lot of MSPs are not great at that. A lot of it's based on referral business of new business. And so finding a board member that can help you with that, I think is great. Also, somebody's networked within the industry. And as you build your team, I'm a big proponent that you always have to look at your team and are they able to support where you're at, where you want to go from a capability standpoint and a just overall maturity level. And sometimes board members can help find you folks within the industry that they know that they might not be a person for your role, but can help guide. So I've seen that work really well. I think the best board members, though, that I've had, and as I reflect on being a board member, and I've sat on a few boards, I'm looking for board members that don't have a lot of ego. And what I mean by that is I want folks that are focused on what's best for the company, not how smart they sound in a board meeting, or somebody that ultimately wants your job, right? You don't want that. You want folks that you can build that vulnerable trust with and really collaborate with, but they're just focused on trying to help you. And I think it's different than a peer group because they're getting into more of the intimacy of what you're trying to drive, and you can share with them your concerns and factors and ask for their help. And those peer group meetings are great, I think, for snippets and points and ideas and kind of expanding your horizons of what others are doing. But a board member can lean in specifically with you to help. And so I've been really fortunate. I've had some phenomenal board members. I our board right now is great, but they have that mindset, and it's not ego driven. And those are really big factors in thinking about, do I create a board, and how do I use it to my advantage? But those are all factors that, if I'm starting and don't have a board and want to look at one, then I would do that. And if you're working with a private equity firm, and most private equity firms have figured this out, I would insist on having independent board members. There's private equity, they're financially focused first, and they might know your space and industry well, but those independent board members are key. And finding somebody that augments where you might not be as strong from a discipline standpoint, as I mentioned, are important factors when thinking about it.
So you talked about your quote unquote first team. Are you a Patrick Lencioni fan? I feel like there's been a couple of references already from the rowing in the same direction to the first team.
Yeah.
One of the things that it's so interesting to me to always learn from folks that have been doing this a little while is maybe how the transition in leadership style, the hindsight of it, and some of the inflection points and some of the things that have grounded you more in your leadership style over time versus the things that you've maybe reconsidered needed to be let go. And so I'm curious, as if you're an avid fan of Patrick Lencioni, then you're obviously thinking about some of this business context and level of management. And what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, we're an EOS shop. We inherited that when I joined the company. And I think EOS is great from a structure standpoint. It really can help making sure you're focused on your primary priorities and things like that. But I think where it's challenged and not as strong, and if you talk to a really great EOS facilitator, they'll talk about it. They bring in Patrick Lencioni because he's much more focused on his methodology is much more focused on the culture of the business, which is critical. And so, culturally, we implemented his methodologies in my last company. We actually used his consulting firm, the Table Group. I'm contemplating that again because bringing it to the new company, I just felt it was super helpful for folks thinking about how do they structure their teams and what they need to look for from a business standpoint. So with any business methodology, I'm a big proponent of you take what works for you and implement that, but not necessarily just drink the Kool-Aid and do everything. But I do like the cultural aspects of what they're providing. And so whether it's 5 dysfunctions of a team or the advantage or others, we've not implemented it corporate wide, but we are using it at a senior leadership team level. So I think of the senior leadership team as team one. And really the benefit of that is we've built a vulnerable trust amongst us. And then we have constructive conflict in a significant way. And I find that when a team can get comfortable and start having that constructive conflict, but then make a decision, commit and go, and then hold one another accountable to actually deliver it, is where the magic starts to happen. And I feel like as an organization, we're now in that process. When I first started, we didn't have it. And sometimes when you introduce a new team member, they don't have that relationship or trust either. But it's fun to see when companies get to that inflection point where your senior leadership team is really, I think, humming and supportive of one another. And really that team one mentality is your first commitment is the senior leadership team, not supporting your team. If you run, as an example, the professional services group, I can't always be thinking about them. I need to be thinking about how do we as an organization move forward and how do I support that? Even might put tax or put problems on my professional services team. How am I thinking about the organization and how we move forward? And that mindset and that shift, in my experience, when senior leadership teams can get there and it starts to permeate into other parts of the organization, that's where the culture and your ability to get things done and drive is important. I'm always challenged with organizations where folks are having conversations in the hallway and not bringing up in the meeting, and they're not having it out. And if you don't have that constructive conflict, my experience has been you're not going to make the progress that you want to make.
Have you come across by chance the interview Ken Coleman did with Dave Ramsey, Patrick Lencioni, and John Maxwell? Have you seen this?
I did not. No.
They've turned it into a podcast episode as well, but it's on YouTube. It's called Over 100 Years of Leadership Advice in 97 Minutes. And it's a fantastic conversation really around so much of this culture piece. And I think you're hitting on something that is maybe something that is tough for smaller companies to do until they kind of are set in stone in some ways culturally. And so this is an interesting thing. Have you found with culture, I feel like there's kind of this desire to install it, from a top-down perspective. And my experience has been that never works. It kind of has to be built from the ground up with the participation of all the people that comprise ultimately the organization. And having been a few organizations yourself, tell me a little bit about how you see the best cultures actually develop, and what are some of the maybe markers that you have now realized are super important to focus on earlier on in the journey than to wait.
Yeah, those are great questions. Culture is a critical thing, not always the easiest to get right. And so it all starts with the people. And you as a leadership team, have you set the proper vision? Do people feel supported? Do they feel heard? Are you being transparent with your information so they feel like they're a part of it? Do they see, critical career paths going forward? And, whether they're an individual contributor or want to be a manager, are you setting those opportunities and kind of career pathing for them? So it all starts and stops with how are you setting the tone? And then it's making sure you have people on the team that feel empowered, that also want to win, and then want to do a great job in supporting customers and clients. And we have really looked at the organization and the people that we have. And if we've got folks that, are not bought in or won't do something, there's a whole can't do, won't do type of scenario where if they can't do something, how do I help them get there through education, experience, whatever it might be, as long as they have the desire and the fundamental focus or sense of urgency, or as Patrick Lencioni talks about, being hungry. We can teach it, right? We can get them there. If they won't do something, that's probably not a person that we want in the organization, because we are so support focused. And, I think we've done a really great job of finding people that are really phenomenal. And so we've upgraded some roles as we've continued to grow. And I find that when you have those great people on the team, it attracts other great people, and they hold one another accountable. Your point around, not being a top-down approach, I totally agree. I mean, where I've seen companies really start to really exceed and really perform, it's a peer-to-peer relationship, meaning I run a department, or I run a group, or I'm an individual contributor. I'm dependent upon you, my peer, to help me execute, whether I'm an account manager, whatever it might be. And how are we able to hold one another accountable and really work through things and not have to escalate everything? I think when you find people that are driven and are hungry and are, as he classifies it, as smart, which is a high emotional intelligence, not a high IQ, but a high EQ, and they're able to work with one another to best support a client and do what's right, I mean, that's where you start to hit your stride. And we're once again, similar to what we talked about earlier, this is a journey, right? You're never at an end state in association with implementing these methodologies. But I find that having the right people and enabling them, having them feel empowered, where you see that inflection point where they start collaborating and working with one another, and really holding one another accountable and not wanting to let one another down, I think that's where you start to see real big strides in your ability to perform. So
Yeah.
I reflect on the Lencioni methodologies a lot. And I've got it to do to continue to figure out how do we move beyond EOS. And we've implemented some of these things that I'm talking about. But once again, it's a journey, and you got to commit to it and go. But I find that when you're able to incorporate some of those methodologies, it permeates through the culture of the company. And, I think people inherently want to do well. They want to do right. They want to do a great job. And, you have to provide them the opportunity to do that. And then you have to set the direction, as I mentioned earlier. So, it's a long-winded response. But culture is a big topic, and there's a lot of aspects and attributes of it.
No, well said. I think the culture piece right now is so top of mind, especially, and this wouldn't be a 2026 podcast if we didn't talk about AI to some extent. But I'll bring it simply in the context of what's happening to workforce, some of the concerns that organizations have with, or the people on the front line have with AI and how it's being brought into organizations. Just this morning, I saw an article on LinkedIn about some of the buyouts that Microsoft is doing for people that have a certain tenure and age combination. And so it seems like this has the opportunity to create a lot of cultural rifts inside of organizations where people are not willing to maybe give a bit of space or room to this. And when you and I were chatting backstage a couple of days ago, you kind of talked a bit about you have a slightly interesting lens right now, which is that of your daughters entering the workforce and kind of what AI is doing to the workforce in general. And so maybe with a lens on people and culture, giving your 2 cents on AI and how do we make sure that we don't absolutely cut the culture and the workforce at the knees as we go through this process?
Yeah, it's a big topic and a timely topic. One that we're talking to many customers about right now, which is, they're considering AI. How do they incorporate it? How do they leverage it? And then we're focused on that's great, but do you have the infrastructure to support it? Are you looking at the right tools? How are you putting process and procedure in place to make sure that it's, not going off the rails, if you will? And then how are you securing it over time? Because it comes in other attack vectors, we all know. Specific to, I have a kiddo graduating from college this year, and she uses AI quite a bit. She has through, her whole college career, if you will. And they're really that first generation, I think, that was using it, not to write papers, but to, help with research and check things and what have you. So she's already pretty familiar with leveraging tools, primarily for research and things like that. She's getting into a career that is still very people focused. And so, in my mind, that as I think of young people and they're looking at this, those monotonous kind of day-to-day transactional type of jobs of data entry and things like that, even in research, obviously are all going away. And so having a focus on, more on the EQ side, the human element is something that she and I talk about and something that becomes an approach. And so similar to our business, we're looking at AI and how do we leverage it as a tool, not how do we use it to replace people. And so the way we're trying to incorporate it now is we're trying to create solutions and tools that, for a technician on a desk, as an example, how are they able to multitask? How are they able to have one pane of glass when it comes to information that enables them to solve a problem more effectively first time? That's a major metric for us is, first time ticket completion, but also the efficiency side, right? And so I think you're going to see a trend that you'll get an opportunity to leverage AI. And there'll, of course, be tier one AI things that happen that it can solve for, but we're fortunate that we still have a complexity to our business that it's coming. It's just when is it going to fully be here? And in the interim, we're focused on how do we leverage it as a tool for our techs to really be more effective and ultimately more efficient. I said in a talk the other day that talked about, top MSPs are able to support between 250 and 350 users per tech. And with, introducing AI, it can go to 1,000 plus. I think that's reality, that's coming. But it's, for me in the organization, it's, hey, do you want to work on very monotonous things or can we automate that? And you as a technician, you're going to want to work on the more interesting, complex things that we've got and that customers have. And this will afford you to do that. And oh, by the way, if you can get visibility to everything that's going on within that client with one pane of glass to help make better informed decisions, to be more effective, they're encouraging it. So we've got tools that we're deploying right now that we've had 20 technicians. We've got close to 100 technicians across the company that are on the desk. that are, bought in and leveraging, and we're getting feedback of what else we can do here. And so we're bringing them into the fold on it, and they know it's not to replace them. It's to, how do we up level them to work on more complex projects, but how are they leveraging it to be more effective with clients? And so that's the way that we're approaching it culturally. I think when I think about it from a customer standpoint, we as MSPs are going to have to look at how we engage clients, and then how do we set up deals and price things as well. I mean, on a per user basis, we're anticipating that clients are going to reduce staff or not grow nearly as much. And if you're directly tied or correlated to price per user, that's not a good trend. And so, do we instead charge for agents or bots or endpoints, and incorporate those? Or do we just change the structure overall? Those are all things that we're contemplating. But, culturally, back to the culture portion, I think that it's coming, and it's already here in a lot of cases. I think a lot of MSPs are struggling with, how do I leverage it and what do I do? Um, I just look at it as a hybrid. I think, for me, at least for the next 10 years, I think that there'll always going to be a human factor. It's going to be hard to fully automate, in my opinion. Um, and people want to talk to people, at least at my generation. Now, younger generations are fine going on chat and leveraging the automation and different tools and things like that. I think it'll ultimately continue to trend that way. But a lot of people want to work with others on the other side, at least for the near term horizon, as far as I'm concerned. And so, anyway,
Yeah.
it's a
Well,
big
you've
topic.
differentiated it very specifically between efficiency and effectiveness. And I think this is an interesting piece of the conversation, because one of the maybe pitfalls of efficiency is just filling people with more things to do. And so effectiveness being kind of on the flip side of that, just being able to do things better. And so with your comment about, we want to get our people focused on more complex problems, this requires kind of a pullback from efficiency to some extent, because what you want to do is give them a little bit of focus time and not be so I guess, hardcore on the maximization of utilization, if you will, for efficiency's sake. And so I'm curious your views on this. As a growing organization, how are you creating space for people to actually work on more complex problems? And if you see sort of maybe a bit of that efficiency trap to some extent.
Yeah, and I lump them together because I think they're both important. Being an operator as a company, I think you do need to also be focused on efficiency. But the effectiveness portion, and why I'm excited about AI, is that first ticket resolution is key and important. People are calling you or contacting you because they want help and they want it fully resolved. And I think that's a primary factor when I talk about effectiveness. The other side for effectiveness for me is, I do want to free up time for not all my technicians, but a number of them, because for me the holy grail is, how do we move to a more proactive model versus reactive?
Yeah.
And what I mean by that is, can I spot trends? Can I look for issues before clients even realize they have them? And I'm not talking about just knock and sock services. I'm also talking about the desk. I mean, that in my mind is a bit of the holy grail, in that if we can free up time of our people to have them focus more proactively, I'd like to get to that model. I think some MSPs claim that they do it, and maybe they do, but most MSPs, I think, are still very reactionary to tickets. And so for me, that's where I'd like to get to. And yeah, having that space for people to reflect and think and spot trends and leverage AI and a tool maybe to help them identify a trend, I think is definitely the direction that it is going. But it's an interesting time. It's an amazing time to be alive. I mean, AI is here and it's growing. I hope it doesn't disrupt our society too much. I think it's been very very focused on it being smarter and faster. Um, what happens when it gets smarter than we are?
Well, yeah.
That's a concern. And so I think the powers that be that are focused on this, and there's a number of people talking about this, but I think it needs to be more focused on soon on empathy for humans, because we're going to soon be not as smart as the machine, if you will. And so I'm hopeful that that starts to get incorporated in some of the AI elements that folks are working on. So yeah, hopefully that answers your question about how we're incorporating it from a culture standpoint. But we're trying to bring folks into the fold and talk to them about how it enables them to be more effective and ultimately more efficient to work on the things they really want to work on. And the feedback so far has been incredibly positive. Now, we're also not talking about it automating people's jobs out, because I think there'll always be that human factor, at least for the foreseeable future.
Yeah, well, to your point earlier, I only have more questions now. So the older I get, the more I learn, the more I know I don't know.
Yes, yes, that's a
So yeah,
good way to
more
say it.
questions for me to ask I suppose, at some point in the near future.
Yep.
Chris, what a fantastic opportunity to chat with you. I look forward to seeing you in Chicago next week as the industry converges for those that are in the Evolve community. So looking forward to a chat and maybe a debrief on some of these things as we process for the next few days, some of the ideas and such. But thank you so much for coming on MSP Confidential. Are you okay if folks reach out through LinkedIn to say hello and connect?
Sure. Yeah, of
Awesome,
course.
awesome. Yeah.
Yeah, it was
So
great talking to you today. Enjoyed the conversation. Thank you for letting me talk and wax on about my experience. I appreciate that. So it's
no,
fun.
I love hearing the views, and I think one of the generational challenges is just that I think we have to get better at bridging some of these things that are so new and difficult for some generations, but also so natural and inherent for others. And
Yep.
this could be maybe a chasm or gap that creates communication and culture challenges over time. Because we were kind of
Absolutely.
on the same playing field for so many years, but there's certainly a diverging piece to that now. So certainly lots to contemplate there.
Yep, for
Well,
sure.
folks, this has been MSP Confidential. Chris Remy, CEO of Convergence Networks. We're here on Fridays at noon Pacific, 3 p.m. Eastern. We'll hope you'll join us for the next one. Chris, hang out backstage for about 30 seconds while I play the outro here, and we'll see everybody at the next one. Ciao for now.